everyone, welcome to the July 28th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, it's all about the race recaps. We're going to look back at last weekend's stake racing, primarily focusing on the race from New York and California. At Saratoga, they ran the Grade 1 Alfred G. Vanderbilt, as well as a couple of turf stakes races, the Boston Spa and the Bernard Baruch on Sunday. And out in California, at Del Mar, we saw the return of last year's three-year-old champion Maximum Security, making his first start for the Bob Baffert barn. So we'll talk about all of that in a little bit. Plenty of ground to cover on this podcast. Craig, how did you look at the racing last week? And I think we've got some interesting figures to discuss on this podcast this week.
Yeah, we sure do. There was some good racing. I wouldn't say it was one of our banner weekends, but there were some solid performances around the country, some interesting ones to discuss from a speed figure standpoint, particularly the Vanderbilt, which I think we're going to start with. So plenty to talk about, and I'm looking forward to the Pacecast coming back here. I like the forecast as well, but I like discussing the top performances.
Yeah, I had to catch myself at the top because I'm so used to saying the TimeformUS forecast. But we're not doing the handicapping this week. Today. We'll get back to that later in the week to look at some Saratoga races on Friday. But this Tuesday, we're just going to look back at last weekend's stake racing. And as you said, we're going to begin with that race at Saratoga, the Grade 1 Alfred G. Vanderbilt. This one featured a very unusual situation. Actually, a number of unusual situations, because even before the race started, we had a gate scratch as the horse that was drawn towards the inside reared up in the starting gate. Even prior to that, we had Whitmore breaking through the starting gate. Just a really weird set of circumstances before the race. The field was reduced to 4, and Volatile was just the lone speed. And I think when riders choose to implement strategies on speed horses where they just don't use a sprinter's speed at all, it creates a really weird situation and doesn't allow them to run the kind of speed figures that you'd expect from a horse like Volatile.
It does. And what was interesting with Volatile was despite that just crazy slow pace that he set, they went 23 and 46 for the opening quarter, which, I mean, you don't even see the cheapest claimers on the grounds run that at Saratoga going 6 furlongs. He still ran pretty fast. He wound up with a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. The final time was 123. Now, I will admit, for probably the first time ever, I actually had to manually tweak our algorithm a little bit because this piece was just so extremely slow that it just didn't fit in. It didn't work. So the overall numbers are more kind of projected, what I think. But the final time was what it is. It's a 123. It was really amazing how fast those horses came home. It was, I looked through my database, is the fastest last quarter mile that I had in there for Saratoga. The last one was a horse whose name I'm forgetting now, Majestic Perfection, I believe, back in like 2009 was the second fastest. And it was in the very same race to Vanderbilt with a very similar slow pace. So that was 10, 11 years ago, whatever it was. As a speed figure guy, I have to be honest, when I look at this race, I'm going to put a line through it. I don't think figures are really very meaningful in there. I have to make one for a race like this, but so I did. But when I evaluate these horses, I'm just not going to put a whole lot of stock into any of these running lines.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I was pretty curious to see what you were going to do with this race, because when I went in the chart, I was really expecting to see that P symbol indicating it's a race that was broken out for pace. Obviously, though, if you did that using the normal algorithm for dirt sprints, you'd have to make the final time figure for this race probably somewhere in the 130s to get a typical speed figure for a Grade 1 sprint race, and that just doesn't really make sense. I don't think inflating that final time figure would have sat well with you. So I understand what you did, and we've talked about the algorithm for dirt sprints before and how it really penalizes horses that set slow paces, and I imagine we would have basically subtracted the maximum amount of points from the final time figure for Volatile if we had used the normal algorithm for this race. So I totally understand you having to do something unusual to make this a speed figure that makes some kind of sense that handicappers can use moving forward. It's just a weird race. I mean, there were only 4 horses from first to last. They're just separated by 4 speed figure points. That's really unusual in dirt sprint. And I just don't understand the tactics with a horse like Volatile. I mean, to me, it's more risky to ride a horse this way when you're 2-5 than it is to just let him set a pace that's comfortable for the horse. I don't know why he wouldn't go out and go 22, 45, and 108, something that we know that Volatile can do. It's just weird to me that you'd risk making the horse go slower than he's ever gone before and hoping he can sprint to the final quarter mile.
Yeah, it was definitely strange. I just think I finally come to the realization that racing has changed. It's changing before our eyes. Jockeys don't ride like they did even 10 years ago. It seems like any horse that makes the lead, the goal is to just go as slow as humanly possible, which, as you say, I'm not sure it's a great strategy. It worked in this case. But, I mean, to be honest, he had to run the fastest quarter mile we've seen at Saratoga in as long as I could remember. And he still was being gained on at the end by Whitmore. So, you know, as I said, I had questions. I did suggest that Volatile would be a single for me. I thought he laid over this field. But, you know, I don't know that we learned a whole lot about him. I'm not ready to say he's a top sprinter in the country just off of this effort, because all of his races have been kind of similar. He's almost like Matoli, who I mentioned on the forecast, where until he got tested, we really didn't know. He's passing all the eye tests, but he's just getting easy trip after easy trip with slow paces where he's either on it or sitting a couple lengths off of it and beating horses that just aren't as good as him. And in this case, maybe you could argue Whitmore is as good as him, but the tactical disadvantage just made it impossible for him to overcome the deficit.
Yeah, and I want to clarify something. I tweeted after the race immediately, you know, something along the lines of, I guess I'm supposed to be impressed by that. I don't know, that performance didn't really do it for me. And I basically got ratioed for that because people don't like knocking winning performances too much. But what I meant is that when a horse goes as slowly up front as Volatile did, I mean, you're supposed to do something special in the last quarter mile. You're supposed to come home faster than the horses behind you because you had the least taxing trip setting that slow pace, whereas the other horses, not only were they going slower than you and they have to run faster to catch up, they were taking dirt in their face, they were having to chase off the rail. I mean, they had it worse than you did on the lead. And Volatile, if you look at the Trackist numbers, his final eighth was tied for the slowest in that field. So it's not like he was running away from them at the end, and maybe they just took his best weapon away, which is his speed, and that's why he didn't do anything extraordinary the final quarter mile of that race. But I've got to say, I mean, when speed horses set that kind of slow pace, I mean, we saw Matoli do it many times, and he would just run away from fields at the end of these races. I don't know, this performance left me a little flat.
Yeah, I can understand that. I do want to add one thing about the P notation. A few months back, I don't remember exactly when it is. I'll tweet it out after we're finished recording the show, but I no longer adjust the final time because of that. I'm using the same variant, and the only thing that will get adjusted is the overall number. So had I used it in this case to boost the number, you would still see the same final time figure.
I think we're actually going to come to an example of that a little bit later in the podcast at Del Mar, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Let's, though, stay at Saratoga for now, and we're going to switch to the turf and talk about the two turf stakes races from last week. One of them did take place earlier in the day on Saturday and produced a minor upset. Sister Charlie was the heavy favorite in the Ballston Spa, though she did not show up with one of her best performances, and no surprise that the horse that was there waiting in the wings to take advantage was Starship Jubilee, who just loves to win races. She always shows up with a good performance, and she did so on Saturday. Not the fastest race in the world, but I think that just speaks to the fact that when Sister Charlie didn't show up, it's not like Starship Jubilee had to run one of her best races to win.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Sister Charlie, it just came down to if she was the old Sister Charlie, she was going to win. I mean, she's a horse who's running the high 120s pretty consistently before tailing off a bit at the end of last year. And she came back, and I would have to say she tailed off a little more. So I don't think that's a very good sign for her, obviously. She's a mare who's always run well off of a layoff before. She's never had a problem with that. She had plenty of pace in here. She had her very own pacemaker setting the fractions. So, I mean, not too much to argue with there. And she was just flat. So I'm not sure what the future holds for her, but she's certainly one I would probably continue to bet against. Starship Jubilee, she's a cool mare at 7. She won a grade 2. And, personally, I think we've said before on here that's probably her ceiling is a grade 2, unless she just happened to catch a really weak field. But that's what she did here once Sister Charlie didn't show up. There wasn't a whole lot in here that was going to challenge her. And she got a nice trip and was able to take advantage. But the 117 that she ran, it's basically right around what she always runs. So while she is a cool mare, I'm not going to be looking for her to move up into grade 1 company and suddenly start being some star of the division.
Yeah, and I want to be careful in the way that I phrase this because I don't want to get too much criticism for this. But, before this race went off, I heard, I was watching the Fox show, Saratoga Live, and, they were just heaping the praise on Sister Charlie. And I want to phrase this carefully. Sister Charlie is a really nice horse, and she's done some amazing things in her campaign in this country over the past couple of seasons. But, there were some who were referring to her as the best turf horse the country's ever seen, or the best female turf horse the country's ever seen. And I think that was going overboard even before the race, because we'll look back at her accomplishments from the past couple years, and yeah, she won the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf in 2018. She beat some solid Europeans in there. Aside from that, she won a string of Grade 1 races, something that we don't often see horses do. I believe she won, I want to say 7 straight or 6 straight Grade 1 races in this country on the turf. In a lot of those, she was beating her Chad Brown stablemates like Rushing Fall and 4-Star Crook, really nice horses. But to say that she's one of the best American turf horses ever, or one of the best turf horses in the world, I think is just making a leap that's not really justified. And we're going to talk about a truly great turf horse at the end of this podcast that also ran this past weekend somewhere else on the globe. But, it's not like Sister Charlie had, such room for error here that if she didn't show up with one of her good races, or if she only showed up with her Flower Bowl performance, that she was a cinch to win. And I think that's what happened, because Starship Jubilee, she doesn't always, as you said, she doesn't always run those speed figures that are Grade 1 level, but she always runs, a speed figure of, in that 115 to 120 range. She's just so rock solid and so consistent. And Sister Charlie, she regressed a little bit, and that was enough to get her beat. And I wonder where they're going to go from here, because as you said, her 2 performances at the end of last year, they were not quite up to par, and it feels like maybe as a 6-year-old, she's just tailed off a little bit.
Yeah, I remember you didn't particularly care for Flower Bowl, if I remember right, last year, and it kind of showed in the Breeders' Cup that was a really good assessment. I missed that Fox part early in the day. I would have to agree. As good as Sister Charlie's been, if you ask me to name the 10 best turf females that I can remember in the last 20 years, I'm not sure she'd even crack the top 10. I'm not going to spend time trying to list it. She certainly had a great career and been a very good mare, but I would never consider her an all-time great. As you said, we're going to talk a little bit about one later on that is, and the chasm between the two would just be immense.
On Sunday, they ran a turf stakes for the males, going the same distance, 1 mile and a 16th. And this one is another race in Saratoga where the pace had a big impact on the outcome. Some Like It Hot Brown, who I'll say I picked him second. I didn't put him on top. But if I had known he was going to be 8-1, I probably would have switched my picks around, because I don't know how he went off at that kind of price. For whatever reason, Halliday, who was the other speed, didn't apply any pressure in the early going. Tyler Gaffalione got to set a pace that was comfortable for Some Like It Hot Brown, and they sprinted into the stretch, and they just couldn't catch this horse.
Yeah, I was really shocked by the price he was in here, because I remember his last race when Instilled Regard beat him, and he was all the talk of Twitter of how well he ran to hang on and be so close at the finish after being part of such a hotly contested and pretty fast pace. And it seems like people have short memories, because outside of Halliday, he was really the only other speed in here, and it just looked like one of those two. I had a feeling they weren't going to go out and cook each other, and that's exactly what happened. I don't even remember. I don't think our pace projector indicated one way or the other that it was going to be a fast or slow pace. I think it was just average. But just given his last race where he went so fast and hung on well, it looked like he was going to be the pace setter, and Tyler Gaffalione gave him a really nice ride ride. He did slow it down a little bit, but not crazy so for this course. And just a good effort. And it's good to see him. He was a horse who kind of vanished from the New York scene for a while. They kind of made him into a synthetic turf or to a synthetic track specialist. But he was a horse who ran third in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf as a 2-year-old and showed plenty of ability on the grass. So I'm glad to see him getting to show his stuff again.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually had to remind myself that Some Like It Hot Brown is actually a New York bred, but they just never run him in New York bred races, so it's easy to forget that. He's actually that horse that won that New York bred maiden race as a 2-year-old where they put the starting gate in the wrong spot and they actually ran a mile and an eighth instead of a mile and a 16th, and they realized after the race was over. I mean, he'll probably be in the running for some New York bred awards at the end of the year, having not run against the New York breds at all so far in 2020 and probably not later on off this performance. But he's really turned a corner. He just seems like he's taken a step forward as a 4-year-old. Turf is definitely the surface for him. I know he's run well in synthetic in the past, and he did so earlier this year as well, but it seems like he's really able to use his speed to great effect in these turf races. And going at distances probably between a mile and a mile and an eighth seems perfect for him. He'll be a player later on in the year.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, he is good on synthetic, as you say, but unless you're going to Woodbine these days, there's not a whole lot of graded stakes races being run on synthetics. And I'd even be interested if they tried him on dirt again. He didn't run terrible the one time he tried it in the bluegrass. I think he might have debuted on it in a sloppy track, but his bluegrass wasn't terrible by any means. So he's certainly a versatile horse. He has tactical speed. He's shown he doesn't have to have the lead to win races. He's been able to track just a little bit off of it and win a couple times on synthetic. So he's a cool horse, and he's only 4, so there's still some room to grow for him. I should mention, I don't even think I managed to get around to it, but he did run, it was a 1:18 Timeform US speed figure for the win. I do think that was hindered a little bit because of the slowish pace and him being up front, but just a good performance. He never looked in danger turning for home.
Yeah, and we should mention, it's not one of these paces like the Vanderbilt where they were just walking up front and every pace figure is color-coded blue. It was more of an even pace than that. But when you let a really good horse like Something Like It Hot Brown, who had certainly run the speed figures in the past that are good enough to win this race, when you allow him a comfortable enough situation like that, you're just not going to reel him in. And that's what happened in this Bernard Baruch. Let's talk about the race that took place on Sunday right before this, one that I think generated a lot of interest in an up-and-coming 3-year-old, that being Happy Saver. This is a horse who had made his debut on the Belmont Stakes Day undercard, had run a race, I think 2 or 3 races after No Parole won the Woody Stevens, and actually ran almost at the exact same time as No Parole. Now, you could talk a little bit about how the speed figure for that race was created, because I know some people had a problem with the fact that Happy Saver got a lower speed figure than No Parole did that day. But that aside, he stretched out for the first time in this allowance race to a mile and an eighth, and you had to like what you saw from this horse because he rated behind horses for the first time, peeled out of the top of the stretch, and really finished like the distance was no problem for him.
Yeah, and for me, he really verified that first race, and that was adding a few new dimensions, as you note. I gave him a 112 that first time out. As you said, there was some questions going in, but looking back at that day, how I did the speed figures, how other people did the speed figures, I really don't have any problem with them. All the races, there haven't been a ton of runbacks, but like Indian Express was part of the earlier card where the track was slower and used a different variant. She's come back to verify that with a stakes win. Happy Saver got a 115 here, so he improved 3 points second time out. And when you look at what the horses have run in behind him, it fits. Bo Luminaire basically ran the same thing he's ran the last 3 or 4 times. High Amplitude basically matched his figure. So the same thing all the way through. And just as the figure guy, back to that Happy Saver race last time, even though he came back and certainly ran well, if you looked at that in isolation, I guess you could say, well, yeah, maybe that figure's wrong. He's really good. But there are a couple horses that have run back for that from that race besides him, and they haven't done anything special. I think they both even regressed on the speed figure a little bit. So it's not one I have a problem with, but not to take anything away from a 115 in your second start, winning both races fairly easily, is a solid beginning to a career. He's the kind I think he still looks a little bit green when he runs. I'd like to see him get a little more experience and not get rushed into stakes races. So I'm not sure what the plans are with him. And when I say stakes races, like suddenly show up in the Travers next time out or something like that, or try to make a rush to the Derby, because I don't think it would turn out very well. But he is a horse with talent. talent and one that I think could eventually be a force in the division.
Yeah, I mean, if you're arguing that a speed figure should be different based solely on the visual impression of how a horse looked crossing the wire, like his Happy Saver did look very impressive in his debut, I think that's going to lead you astray, because if you look back at the also-rans in that June 20th race, I think it's almost impossible to argue that the speed figure should have been higher. And as you said, Happy Saver came back and he probably improved a little bit, and the speed figures for this race, they reflect that. I like this horse. I thought early on in the race he'd be in trouble because I don't think that was the trip that Todd Pletcher had drawn up for him. Raiding in behind horses early, I'd imagine they'd want to get a horse like this out into the clear like he was in his debut. But he only got into the clear at the top of the stretch, and you could see when Arad Ortiz hit him a couple times with the left hand, his stride just visibly lengthened. And I mean, he just put this race to bed very quickly. And Bo Luminari looked like he might have had it won at the top of the stretch, and Happy Saver just ran right by him. This could be a very talented 3-year-old. He's going to have to run faster to get on terms with horses like Honor AP and Tiz the Law, but he still has upside, so this is a very exciting second half of the season 3-year-old. And speaking of 3-year-olds in Todd Pletcher's barn, I don't want to overlook a race from last Wednesday at Saratoga, as Colonel Liam, a 3-year-old who was making his turf debut against a field of older horses, a very similar situation to Happy Saver, except on the turf, he was pretty impressive. This is a horse who had yet to cross the wire first. He'd actually been disqualified out of a maiden victory in his debut, but he had plenty of turf pedigree on the dam side, and he really ran to it in this race.
Yeah, he actually got put up right in his debut. I think he got fouled, and he didn't finish first, but he got elevated to first. But yeah, he was a horse who came out. He had that big price tag as when he was sold at I forget what sale it was. It was over $1 million, but he hadn't been all that impressive on dirt, and he was tried on turf. And I thought this was a really good effort. He was in against some older horses in here as a 3-year-old, and he looked like he was meant for turf the way he handled it. I wasn't sure about his breeding, but it certainly didn't seem to be any issue there at all. He got a 114 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which would put him right there with the top 3-year-olds we've seen in the division on grass.
Yeah, he's one of these funny pedigrees where he's by Liam's map out of a Bernardini mare. That doesn't really scream turf at all, but his second dam was Wonder Again, who was that very good horse for Phillips Racing Partnership, and Jimmy Toner. I think she won the Flower Bowl. She used to battle with Risk Averse back in the early 2000s. So there was definitely turf pedigree deeper in the female family, and he certainly ran to it. And I just highlighted this race because he's a 3-year-old who's running a 114 TimeformUS speed figure. I mean, that doesn't sound great in the context of, the top older turf horses in the country, but among the 3-year-old division, I mean, if they look at trying to target a race against a horse like Decorated Invader or Gouffo, I mean, this kind of number fits very well against those horses who are considered at the top of the division. So I'll be interested to see where they go with this horse from here.
Yeah, I'd agree. I would certainly imagine they're going to keep him on turf off of this effort. He just looks so much better and more comfortable running over it.
On Thursday at Saratoga, again, not a stakes race, but we saw an allowance race on a pretty high speed figure. The feature this day was going the same distance as the Alfred G. Vanderbilt, 6 furlongs on the dirt, and this race actually earned the same speed figure as Admiral Lynch, stalked the pace on the outside and just ran away from a pretty good group of allowance horses.
Yeah, he beat some good ones in here. And Honest Mischief, the Chad Brown horse, who's run some good races. Bone Raison, who I know is a favorite of yours. Even Mijos had come back with some big figures, but he really dusted this field. It was a really solid effort. He was coming out of a strong race at Churchill where he ran second behind Absolutely Aiden. That one returned. I think he actually returned over the weekend to win a nice stake easily at Ellis Park. All in all, this was a good effort and makes it look like he's a horse who could possibly be competitive in stakes company. Now, don't get me wrong, just because his figure's anywhere near Volatiles doesn't mean I would consider those two in the same class. It was definitely the pace scenario which made him that close, in my opinion. But I thought this was probably the best effort that he's ever had and promising for the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this horse, I mean, he's run a lot of times. This was his 17th start, but he's only a 4-year-old. And he's one of these horses that actually has been in the barns of both Jason Service and Jorge Navarro. But it just seems like he runs well for any trainer because he's now with Mike Maker and he's running some of the best races of his career. So I was pretty impressed by this performance. There were some no-shows in here. Horses like Honest Mischief and Wendell Fong, they probably didn't run their best races. But the speed figure says that Admiral Lynch is going to be bound for stakes soon. So this was a good effort.
Yeah,
Actually,
the interesting thing
yep.
you mentioned you mentioned he was with Jorge Navarro and Jason Service, but his best figures have come since he transferred to the barn of Mike Maker. All three of his races have been faster than anything he had ever run before. So, for whatever reason, Mike Maker seems to have this horse figured out, and he's running great.
Yeah, we've talked about this on the show a lot, that it's not always this convenient narrative that horses that run well for Jason Service and Jorge Navarro did so because X, Y, and Z. Sometimes horses are just going to run well for anybody, and they weren't really benefiting from whatever was being done to them. So we'll see how Admiral Lynch continues to develop in the Mike Maker barn. The race right before this allowance race on Thursday was a maiden turf sprint going 5.5 furlongs, and another. Actually, this was a 4-year-old with a pretty impressive performance off the layoff for Chad Brown by the name of French Reef. This horse had made one start late in his 3-year-old season at Aqueduct, going 2 turns, got tired on the lead that day, but turning back to a sprint has really brought out the best in this horse.
Yeah, it looks like Chad Brown found his niche because that was an impressive performance. You don't see a lot of maiden turf sprints, even for older horses, one with a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure. This horse just has blazing speed. I mean, he flew out of the gate. His early pace figure was a 1:38, and he just kind of kept going. I mean, I definitely don't want to be one of those he could have run faster because I don't think that's the case. But I do think he did it well within himself and just looked good. And this horse looks like a future turf stakes sprinter to me.
I totally agree. He just ran them off their feet. And I remember watching some of his workouts before his debut at Aqueduct last year and kind of noting he was really headstrong, hard to rate, and that's the tendency that he showed in that first race where he was just trying to run off on the lead through the first half mile, and you can't do that in a turf route. But that's not a problem when you get to run fast every step of the way in a turf sprint. So as long as he continues to break well, he's just going to be a tough horse to reel in, and we'll see how he progresses through his allowance conditions if they try stakes company soon, but he's certainly running stakes level speed figures even just in this maiden score. Let's move on to Del Mar in California to talk about the return of Maxim Security. This horse was making his first race since exiting the Jason Service barn, come back from Saudi Arabia after winning the Saudi Cup in a pretty impressive performance over Midnight Bisou out there. And I think the big question was, is this going to be one of the horses that regressed coming out of the Jason Service barn, or would he get back to his best races for Bob Baffert? And I don't know if we got a definitive answer in this San Diego, but it's definitely good to see this horse show that same grit and fight that he did in all of his races last year.
Yeah, he sure did. And to be honest, I don't think it was the easiest trip in the world. And I thought he ran pretty darn well. I saw a lot of people just didn't like the race and were knocking him and saying that's not maximum security. But I thought he ran just fine. He got a 125 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which he had maxed out with, I think, a 129. And when he won the Cigar Mile, he got a 130 Timeform rating over in Saudi Arabia when he won their $20 million race. And I thought it was a good effort because some horses took it to him early. He wasn't going to get that easy lead that some people might have expected. Mid-court and Higher Power, the jockeys both went after him, and he just kind of let him go. The pace was quick. We have all the fractions in red, and then he was able to tip out and wear down mid-court through the lane. I mean, it was close, but he showed that gameness that you talk about. And it's not like mid-court's some slouch. He's run some really good figures in the past, and I think he obviously ran very well this day. Strong effort from him, and I look forward. I assume he's going to run in the Pacific Classic next, and we'll see who shows up. But based on what I saw on Saturday, I would expect an even better performance next time.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually missed this race live. I think I was eating dinner during the race and forgot to watch it. But I went on Twitter right afterwards and looked at some of the reactions, and I said to myself immediately, oh, I guess Maximum Security lost because people sound pretty down on him. And then I went and watched the race and was kind of surprised he actually got up to win. I thought he ran pretty well. You know, you have to realize with Maximum Security, he's turned into one of these horses that's never going to draw off and win by 10 lengths like he did against Maiden claimers early in his career. He's a horse that seems to really like a fight. In all of his races, we've seen him have to be ridden pretty hard, even when Louis Size was on him in some of those races last year. You know, he came under pressure way before it spun to run in that Cigar Mile, but he just keeps finding more as the jockeys ask him for it. And we saw that under Abel Cedillo in this race as well. Mid-court, it looked like he had spurted away at the top of the stretch, but Maximum Security just came and got him and was pretty game to get it done. As you said, you know, the track was playing slowly, and you know, maybe people were a little unimpressed by the come home time of this race, but it earned a pretty high speed figure, and I think he's going to move forward off this too. I liked this effort.
Yeah, both him and, like I said, I think midcourt ran as well because of the fast pace. He actually got a point or two higher than Maximum Security did on our speed figures. And, you know, it was a strong race. As you said, the track has been fairly slow out there, but there were other routes on the day. I think somebody asked me on Twitter what I thought about the Beyer speed figure, which I hate talking about, but I only bring it up because we're basically the same. I think I have it as a 123 and Beyer had a 101 or 102. So using that 20-point adjustment, we're right in the same ballpark. It's just ours is upgraded a little bit because of pace. So I don't think it was really a tough day at all for speed figure making.
Yeah, it's funny. You know, people tend to remember with the last thing that they saw. And in the San Diego, we saw horses, you know, staggering to the wire a little bit, you know, on, you know, the last bits of energy as Maximum Security was just trying to fend off midcourt in the final strides, coming home in a slow final fraction. And in the AG Vanderbilt, we saw Volatile, you know, streaking across the wire, running faster than you see a sprint horse ever finish a race. But it all has to do with how they started the race. And, you know, sometimes you've got to look at the entire picture, not just the last scene that you saw of the race. And that's how you have to assess these horses.
Yeah, we saw something that we don't see a lot anymore, and that's the other riders really tried to take it to the heavy favorite early, and it just didn't work out. He showed he was game, and I think he should probably get a little extra credit for that.
The race right before the San Diego was the San Clemente for the 3-year-old fillies. This is a grade 2 event going a mile on the turf. And Laura's Light, she was the 6-5 favorite in this spot for Peter Miller. She's been pretty solid on the turf all through the winter and spring, winning a few stakes and picked up a grade 2 stakes win here. Don't think this was the toughest grade 2 we're going to see this year, but she stalked a fast pace and was pretty game to hold on.
Yeah, she just wins. I mean, she's one of those horses that if she gets a field that she should be able to beat, she has that good tactical speed where she always seems to find the right position. She's won a grade 3 sprinting on turf. She's won going long on turf. A grade 3, now a grade 2. So she's just a really solid, versatile, tactical filly. I don't know that she's ready to run in grade 1s, at least not against horses on the East Coast, but you know, she's solid. She got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure for this win, which was a career best. Something you expect as 3-year-olds progress. They should be getting faster, and she is. So I'm not sure where the upside's going to end, but there could still be some there.
Now, I know your assistant typically does the Del Mar figures, but I do want to ask you about this race because this one does have the P rating, and it's an unusual situation where you actually had to adjust the figure down because the pace was faster than you'd expect to see in a race like this. I'm not used to seeing that kind of situation.
Yeah, it actually happens quite a bit on turf. And what happened is we were having to use that P thing and just artificially knock races down because turf, very rarely do the horses run as fast as they're capable because the paces are often just slowed down. It's a big dash to the finish, as most people know. But there are times where the horses go out, they go quick, and it's just going to enhance that final time but higher than what they would run under optimal circumstances. And what we found was, particularly in these races, when we knocked them down, it was having too big of an influence on our pace projector, where horses who were really quick were getting underrated. So that's why we kind of rework this P rating. Generally, it's going to go the other direction, especially on dirt where the P is. We're going to upgrade the overall figure because the pace was slow. You'll basically never see this done on dirt where figure will get knocked down because the pace was fast. But on turf, you're going to see it in both directions. But more often than not, when we have to use the P label, it's because the pace was really quick like this one.
And I should say, since it's been a while since we've done these Pacecasts and talked about these races in depth after the fact, when we're talking about something like the P rating, what we mean is that's the number that you see next to the race rating in both the TimeformUS charts and the TimeformUS PPs. The race rating in the PP line would be all the way on the left. It's that number in the white box. And in the TimeformUS charts, it's up next to the race name at the top. So you San Clemente for this grade 2, you see the race rating is a 105 with a P next to it, and Craig has come up with a bunch of different letter codes like P to indicate why a race speed figure might have been adjusted in some way due to a reason. And in this reason, the case for P means pace. The pace, as Craig explained, was faster than expected, turf racing is typically have slower paces, so you have to adjust them sometimes based on that. So you'll typically see some other codes like T for a timing error, and there are a bunch of them that I can't reel them all off now, but if we're talking about this and haven't explained it properly and you haven't listened before, that's what we're referring to.
Yeah, and those can be found on TimeformUSblog.com. There's a detail of every code that we use. And with this race in particular, I just pulled up the worksheet that my assistant uses, and there were 3-mile turf races on the day at Del Mar. And had we used the variant that we used for the other two, this race would have been through the roof fast. All the horses would have been making big jumps up, much higher than you would even expect just because they're maturing 3-year-olds. But if you group them all together, then you're going to kind of artificially knock down those other races. So we've just learned through experience over doing so many races, and turf racing's getting even these days more and more prevalent in the U.S., how to better rate them. And like a race like this, I'm really comfortable with using that P and showing you that, yeah, the final time was actually a 115, but the performance is more like a 109. So if somebody on turf wanted to say these aren't speed figures or performance ratings, I wouldn't have any problem with that.
We saw another turf stakes on Sunday at Del Mar for the older horses. This was the Grade 2 Eddie Reed, one of the big summer prizes on the grass at Del Mar every summer. And this one was won by United, who's just turned into one of the most consistent turf horses in the country. I still don't know really how he ranks against the best horses, in the Midwest or on the East Coast, because typically the California turf division is a little bit weaker. But he did run well against Rock Emperor in that prior race, beating that one by a nose. No East Coast invaders in this race. He just beat that California turf division, and he's never a horse that's going to win by a huge margin, but he just shows up every time.
Yeah, he does. And I thought what was interesting here, he was turning back in distance. And when you see that, and as soon as they broke out of the gate, his rider got him into really good position early in the race. And you just kind of knew it was over. I mean, because who was going to outkick United from there when he had a head start on him? And, Sharp Samurai made a good run at him late, but nothing particularly overwhelming. He got fairly close, but I don't think the result was ever in doubt, and United was able to win yet again. I don't have the official speed figure. We are having they did something different on the turf. They were using new run-ups that were much shorter than they've ever used before. So we're investigating that, but it looks like the pace was just average for the race, and the speed figure is going to be in that 120 to 121 range, which is what United generally runs. And I thought it was a solid effort, as you said. I wouldn't want to take him if he shipped east and tried horses at Saratoga, but I doubt that's going to happen. And he certainly proved that he can step up when he needed to in the Breeders' Cup Turf. So another good effort from him. And he's the kind that bettors tend to underrate. I know I did it for myself for a little while because he just wins, but he doesn't win flashy. He doesn't run big figures, but he just seems to have a nose for the wire.
Yeah, and when he did try that Breeders' Cup Turf against Bricks and Mortar, he certainly stepped up and ran a much faster speed figure. So we'll see if he can do that again later in the year when he inevitably gets a tougher test than he did in this Eddie Reed. But as you said, it's really encouraging that he can do it over multiple distances because a mile and an eighth is very different from a mile and a half, but he still ran just as well in this race. And we'll wrap up the California action with a Friday allowance race. This one also on the turf, going a mile and 3/8. And this race featured a bit of an upset as Proud Pedro rallied from well off the pace to get up to win into a pretty slow pace. And I think that's why we have this speed figure so high compared to the final time.
Yeah, it was an interesting race. We don't get a whole lot of mile and 3/8 races, especially out there at Del Mar. But he did come in these races. I tend to focus on the horse that has the top late speed ratings, but he really jumped it up in here. As you said, it's definitely one that was bumped up because of pace. The pace was glacial in here, but this is one that won't get that P rating because we already kind of upgrade horses based on their closing fraction. So that's built in. He went from a 115 final time up to a 124 rating. And it's kind of interesting. You see a big gap back to second, even though he won by less than a length. He actually has an 8-point higher rating than a runner-up North County guy. And that's just because of how fast he finished in the race. He was absolutely dead last in the field, 4.5 lengths back after the half mile, and was able to make that up on the field. So if you're wondering, if you're not used to how TimeformUS speed figures work, you would never see this on dirt. But late speed is more important on the turf. We see it time and time again, and Proud Pedro really flashed some at this extended distance.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's a horse that's a 4-year-old now, and he had run some nice races as a 3-year-old, not really graded stakes level, but he had run okay in some listed stakes races. But one of his best races prior to this was going a mile and a quarter. He had won 2 back against Optional Claiming Company, and here he was going a mile and 3/8, and it just seems like maybe these longer distances allow him to produce that electric finish like he did in this race. And as you said, I think moving forward, it's up to the handicapper when you see a big disparity like this between the final time figure and the TimeformUS speed figure. Based on the situation this horse faces next time, you've got to decide if you think that this performance, the 115, is going to be more predicted, his final time number, or the 124. If he gets in another race with a slow pace, I mean, it's not going to be every time that he can produce this kind of finish and win into a slow pace. That's going to be tough on a closer. But if he gets into a race with a fast pace, you might want to look at that 124 and say, oh, well, if he did that kind of finish in a race that featured an unfavorable circumstance, he can arguably do even better in a race that features a favorable circumstance. So it's up to the handicapper to decide how you want to view that.
Yeah, and the thing you have to keep in mind is you have to look at the horses who are going to be setting the pace. This was a race we actually had labeled as no speed, as a one of the newer labels that we have. And it really kind of obviously played out that way. But the whole reason for that label was to indicate that we don't think there's really any front runners that are going to step up and take advantage of the lack of pace. And that certainly played out here. But my point is that's something you have to consider in these races where the pace is slow, is just how good were the front runners that the horse was running down. In this case with Proud Pedro, I'm not so sure, but I do tend to lean to your side where I think he's just a horse who's really going to like this is the more extended distances. 3-year-olds don't get a lot of chances to run at 11 and 12 furlongs or longer unless they step up and face older. So for the most part, they avoid them. But as a newly turned 4-year-old, if he likes a mile and 3/8, a mile and a half, he's going to have ample opportunities to try it.
For the final 2 races we're going to discuss on this podcast, we're going to go outside of the United States. For this first one, just right north of the border to Canada, to discuss the Grade 3 Marine Stakes from Saturday. And this one featured a 3-year-old that I hadn't heard of yet until I went back and watched this race, Sherrill Spite. This horse had been very impressive in his 7-furlong debut on the turf pretty recently. And he tried the synthetic here, going the 2 turns for the first time, and this horse, I don't know what he's going to ultimately want to do, turf, synthetic, dirt, but he's got a lot of ability because he was pretty impressive in this race.
Yeah, he sure was. I assume he's pointing to the Queen's Plate, which is why he was in this Marine. I do think he's an Ontario bred off the top of my head, but he was super impressive in his maiden win on the turf. He did so sprinting, got a nice 107 TimeformUS speed figure that day, and he just really turned it up another notch here. He's it faced a really good Colton Lucky Curlin, actually, who had shown a lot of promise early in his career and just beat him pretty easily. Now, the pace wasn't much in here. It was definitely on the slow side. But his main foe, Lucky Curlin, was right there with him early, just a length behind or so, and he outkicked him late. Got a 117 TimeformUS for the win on this day, and I would imagine he is the horse who's the Queen's Plate favorite right now based on these two efforts.
I actually just looked it up. Cheryl Spite is a Kentucky bred. So even though they ran in this prep race for the Queen's Plate, they're not going to be able to run there. So, I mean, we'll have to see what they decide to do with this horse, because it does seem like he's got plenty of options. He certainly handled the turf really well in his debut, even though he improved on the synthetic in this race. And I will say, looking at his pedigree, it's just all this classy turf breeding on the dam side. I mean, his dam is Perfect Cheryl, who won the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf a number of years ago. This is her first really good foal, but Perfect Cheryl herself, she's out of Lady Cheryl, which makes her a half-sister to Shakespeare, that very good millionaire turf horse from a number of years ago. So there are a lot of options on the turf for this horse, and it seems like he's certainly capable of going a mile. So I wonder if they, shoot for the stars and go for a race like the Woodbine Mile against older horses, or if they bring him down to the United States. There are definitely options there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I thought for sure I was going to call him a she, but instead I made him a Ontario bred. So I'm going to have to dislike this horse until he shows up in the gate. Now, I'm just kidding. He's certainly exciting. I would be curious to see what he could do on dirt, because as you say, there is some breeding there, but he's got that good tactical speed. He rates. It's not like he's a runoff type that goes fast. He even showed that in his debut sprinting, where all the fractions were blue, so it didn't look like he'd have much trouble stretching out, and he sure didn't. And exciting prospect north of the border.
Let's stay outside of the United States and cross the pond, go over to Europe, and talk about that race from Saturday morning, or at least Saturday morning over here. The King George VI and Queen Elizabeth Stakes, as Enable won this race for the third time. Not three consecutive. She actually won it in 2017, 2019, and now in 2020 as a 6-year-old. And I know she was only beating two rivals, and some people might, have trouble getting really invested in a race that just has such a short field like that. But, I mean, she put forth one of her best efforts, and she's just magnificent.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about a superstar. This is a mare who is undoubtedly a superstar, having won multiple arcs, won this race 3 times, always runs big time form ratings, and she's just amazing. It's great that she came back again for another year. I assume they're shooting for the arc again. We'll see how the ground turns out that day. I don't think it did her a lot of favors last year, but there were some questions. Maybe she lost a step, but I don't think so watching this race on Saturday. I had actually set my alarm originally to get up and watch it, but, we're even earlier here when it comes on, and I decided against it, reset it. I was like, I can just watch the replay. It's not like I'm going to bet a 3-horse field. But when I woke up, it was the first thing I did that day, and just really good to see her back. We can never have enough superstars in this game, and she certainly fits the bill.
Yeah, and as someone, speaking for myself, who's pretty young, as far as commentators on this sport go, I always want to, temper my enthusiasm a little bit and try not to disrespect the great horses of old, because, people can go overboard praising these modern thoroughbreds, and their accomplishments often don't quite compare to great horses of the 50s, the 60s, especially the 70s, but this case with Enable, when you look at her accomplishments, I don't think it's a stretch to call her one of the greatest European horses of all time. I mean, you just haven't seen horses win these top races over and over again, year after year, come back and seem to get better with age. She's now a 6-year-old, and she's running races that are just as good, if not better, than when she was a 3-year-old. She just really is something else, and I don't think it's stretched to heap that much praise on her.
No, I don't think it is at all. And I mean, it's easy to forget in all her accomplishments that she actually came over here and won a Breeders' Cup, which is just an amazing accomplishment. And one of my favorite horses, I like to think of myself as mostly a bettor who likes horses as well. But when a horse like her runs, I turn off that betting process and just watch and hope she wins. And I know I'll be rooting as hard as anybody that she can come back and win the ARC again this year for that third one.
Yeah, that'll be really exciting to see. Well, that's all the racing for this week. I hope you enjoyed our in-depth recap. It's been a while since we've done this, and it's always fun to look at these races in retrospect and try to assess what happened and make some observations that we hopefully can use in the future. And speaking of the future, we're going to record another podcast this week on Friday as we look forward to the card at Saratoga this upcoming Saturday. The feature, of course, is the Grade 1 Whitney, so looks like an exciting race coming up pretty soon. There's plenty of top handicap horses pointing there, so we'll talk about all of that on this upcoming Friday podcast. For now, though, remember you can always listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week. I'm going to be back at you with another podcast on Friday.